The discovery was made not by a team of archaeologists, or by a curious historian with a grant, but by a boy chasing a rabbit. It was the autumn of 1979, in the bottomlands of the Mississippi Delta, a landscape of crushing poverty and profound, layered silence. The boy, whose name would later be scrubbed from the official reports, was 10 years old. His family lived on the edges of what was once the vast Fairhope plantation, a place whose grand columns had long since rotted into the earth, its history swallowed by kudzu and time. He was hunting for his dinner, a simple enough act, when the rabbit led him to a place the locals had always called the Hanging Tree, an ancient, gnarled oak that sat alone in a field. But the tree wasn't what he found. It was the ground beneath it. In the wash of a recent rain, a small, muddy depression had opened. And inside, half exposed, were bones. Not animal bones. The small, unmistakable curve of the human skull. The boy's memory of the event was fractured for decades, a series of terrifying snapshots, the pale curve of bone against the dark earth, the shouting of his father, the sudden arrival of a sheriff's deputy whose face betrayed a flicker of something that wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The hole was quickly filled, not by law enforcement or a forensic team, but by the boy's own father and a few neighbors, men who knew the unspoken rules of the Delta. The sheriff, a man whose family had held power in the parish since before the Civil War, took the boy's father aside. The details of that conversation were never shared, but the message was clear: this was a grave. A lost grave. And it was best left lost. The boy was told he had found an old Indian burial ground, that it was a sacred place, and that it was not to be disturbed. He was told to forget it. But the image of that small skull, pale and impossibly fragile against the dark Mississippi soil, was seared into his mind. He did not forget it. He couldn't. For 40 years, the memory of that discovery festered in the collective memory of the county, a whispered ghost story no one dared to officially acknowledge. It was a secret that everyone seemed to know, a crime that had no victim, no perpetrator, and no name. But the ground always holds its secrets, and sometimes, it simply refuses to be silent anymore. This is the story of the forgotten ones of Fairhope, a story written not in court records or history books, but in a shallow, unmarked grave. To understand the silence that had grown around that field for over a century, you have to journey back to the end of the most devastating conflict in American history, the Civil War. By 1865, the South was a ruin. The economy, built entirely on the backs of an enslaved workforce, had been shattered. The social order, a brutal hierarchy of white supremacy, had been violently upended. The Fairhope plantation, like thousands of others across the former Confederacy, was a microcosm of this collapse. Its owner, Ezekiel Calloway, a man who had built his empire on cotton and cruelty, was dead, killed in the final weeks of the war near Mobile. His mansion, a symbol of a bygone era, was a gutted shell. The fields, once meticulously tended, were overgrown. And the 400 souls he had held in bondage were free. For a brief, radical moment, it seemed like a new world was possible. This was the era of Reconstruction, a period of immense promise and violent backlash. For the first time in American history, the federal government attempted to rebuild the South on a foundation of racial equality. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency established to aid the transition from slavery to freedom, established schools and courts. Black men were given the right to vote and even hold office. For a few short years, the Delta was a crucible of possibility. African American families like the McCains, the Shaws, and the Bakers, who had been the property of Ezekiel Calloway, were now legally citizens. They could marry, they could own property, they could work for wages, and they could dream. They were no longer bound to the land by law, but by circumstance. With no money, no transportation, and no prospects beyond the county line, many stayed. They became sharecroppers, working the same land they had once been forced to labor on, but now in a new form of economic bondage. Their relationship with their former masters, and the new class of white men who rushed in to take their place, was poisoned by a deep-seated hatred that refused to die. This hatred manifested in a campaign of terror the likes of which the country had rarely seen. White supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the more secretive Knights of the White Camellia rose from the ashes of the Confederacy with a singular, brutal goal: to restore the pre-war racial hierarchy by any means necessary. They used violence, intimidation, and murder to dismantle Reconstruction, to drive blacks from the polls, and to burn down the schools that were teaching them to read. The Fairhope area in the late 1860s was a war zone in all but name. It is within this context that we must place our own story, a story that begins in earnest in the year 1868, with a woman named Delphine McCain. Delphine was the daughter of a man who had been the blacksmith for the Callaways, a skilled craftsman who had been permitted to learn a trade, a privilege that both elevated him and marked him as a threat. Her mother, a woman of fierce intelligence, had been the housekeeper for the Callaway family, and she had passed on to her daughter the skills of reading and writing that she had surreptitiously learned from a sympathetic tutor. This made Delphine a rarity in the Delta. By 1868, she was a young woman of nearly 20, and she had become the de facto teacher of the community's children, holding classes in a small, wooden church built by the freedmen on the edge of the Fairhope property. The church was more than a place of worship, it was the soul of the community. It was a center of hope, a symbol of their newfound autonomy. And that made it a target. The men who opposed their freedom understood that a literate man was a dangerous man. A literate man could read a contract, could understand the law, could not be cheated as easily. The church and its school were a threat to the New Old Order. In the summer of that year, the church was burned to the ground. The local white authorities, complicit in the act, declared it an accident. No one was arrested. It was a message. It was a message that the law was not for them, and that their dreams of a new life were something to be met with violence. Delphine McCain was not a woman to be easily intimidated. While the men of her community were often forced to walk a tightrope of deference and fear, she possessed a quiet, unshakable courage. She had seen what the hanging tree, the same tree where the boy would find the bones over a century later, was used for. She had seen the bodies of men who had simply looked at a white woman the wrong way, or who had tried to vote. Her community lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror, but they also possessed a deep, abiding hope for a better future, a hope that was personified by the federal government's presence, however tenuous it was. This hope drove her to keep teaching, first in the ruins of her own home, and then, more defiantly, in a new, larger building constructed with the help of a Northern Aid Society. She was a beacon, and she was a problem. The story that has been pieced together, from fragments of oral history passed down through generations and a single, almost illegible letter found in a state archive, centers on a specific incident. In late September of 1868, a group of men from a neighboring county, men who were known to be connected to a particularly violent chapter of the Klan, rode into the Fairhope settlement. They were not there to intimidate, this time. They were there to collect a tax. The tax was a common practice in that lawless region, a subscription to the Klan's coffers, a payment for the privilege of being allowed to live. When the families refused to pay, citing their poverty and their rights as citizens, the men became enraged. Their leader, a man named Silas Rook, a failed merchant who had lost his business to a northern carpetbagger and harbored a deep, festering hatred for anyone who had been granted the opportunities he felt he was owed, made a threat. He would be back. He would burn their new school, and he would make an example of the woman who ran it. The community was terrified. They sent a writer to the nearest Freedmen's Bureau agent, a man who was stationed over 40 miles away, a journey that would take nearly 2 days. They appealed to the local sheriff, the same man whose family would later oversee the burial of the evidence. He told them it was likely just an idle threat, and that they should mind their own business and stay out of trouble. They were alone. In a final act of desperation, Delphine McCain decided to try and flee. She, along with her elderly mother and several other families who had no protection, packed what little they could carry and began a journey north on foot, hoping to reach a town where the presence of federal troops would offer some semblance of safety. They were intercepted before they even made it to the county line. They were brought back, not by the Klan, but by the sheriff and his deputies who said they were protecting the peace. There is a sworn affidavit, a rare surviving document, from a man named Cyrus Shaw, one of the men who attempted to flee. He writes that the sheriff told them, "You are not being taken back to the settlement. You are being taken home. There is nowhere else for you to go." That was the lie. Now, 3 miles from the main road, in a dark, bottomless hollow where the swamp begins to take over, there is a place the locals call the Devil's Denver. It is a patch of land that is perpetually damp, a place where the mosquitoes are thick and the air is heavy with decay. It is the place where the official story of that night has its beginning and its end. What happened in the Devil's Den is not a matter of recorded history. It is a matter of whispered testimony, of a legend that was passed from parent to child in hushed tones. The story told is one of a kangaroo court, a mock trial conducted by the very sheriff who had brought them there. The charge was conspiracy to incite insurrection. The evidence was the simple act of attempting to leave. The sentence was a severe one. The accounts are fragmented. A testimony gathered by a federal investigator a few years later, but never acted upon, describes how the men of the group were separated from the women. The men, including Cyrus Shaw and Delphine's father, the blacksmith, were reportedly beaten and then tied to the trees, a display of terror. It is what happened to the women, and to Delphine herself, that forms the core of the horror. The testimony, which we must acknowledge is unverified, describes a scene of unimaginable cruelty. Delphine McCain was bound and accused of the capital crime of teaching black children to read and write. Her mother was made to watch. She was made to watch the destruction of her daughter, piece by piece. We won't burden the listener with the full, grotesque specifics of what is said to have happened in the Devil's Den that night. It is enough to say that the accounts speak of torture, of a mindless, depraved violence that had no purpose other than to inflict absolute degradation. It was an attempt to crush the spirit of an entire community. It was a message, but it was one that was meant to remain hidden. Before the sun rose, the last of them were dead. The men, the women, and the 2 children who had been with them. It was not a quick death. They were not simply shot. The accounts describe injuries inflicted with tools and ropes, a prolonged, ritualistic savagery. The bodies of Delphine McCain and her mother were reportedly taken back to the hanging tree, a final act of desecration, a statement of power. And there, in the cold, dark earth, they were buried. Not in the churchyard. Not in a plot of land. But in a shallow, pitiful grave, a place where the lost and the unhallowed were put to rest, a place that would be forgotten by all except those who had been forced to dig it. The cover-up began the moment the last shovelful of dirt was thrown. The men who committed the acts, led by Silas Rook and the sheriff, represented a system of power. They were law enforcement, they were local businessmen, they were the very people who were supposed to enforce the law. The families left behind in the settlement were terrified. They knew that to speak was to invite the same fate. The official story, quickly and effectively disseminated, was that the group had been killed by a band of unknown desperados while attempting to flee the county. To make it stick, the attackers created a narrative of flight, of a justifiable killing of fugitives. The names of the dead were not published in the local newspaper. There was no coroner's inquest. Their property, what little they had, was simply absorbed into the holdings of the local white landowners. The community of Fairhope, what was left of it, retreated into a shell of silence. They had to survive, and survival meant forgetting. It meant burying the horror in the same place the bodies were buried, deep within the earth, and deep within their hearts. But the truth, like an old wound, has a way of festering and refusing to heal. The silence of the Fairhope families for over a century was a language of its own. It was a language of survival. Every family had its own secret, its own legend that was whispered at night, too dangerous to speak aloud in the light of day. It was a secret that was almost lost to time, but not entirely. The soil itself kept a record. Generations of sharecroppers who worked the fields around the hanging tree knew that there was something wrong with that spot. Their plows would occasionally turn up a bone, a fragment of a button, a rusty, misshapen piece of metal that looked suspiciously like a handmade nail. These artifacts were quickly reburied or thrown into the nearest swamp. To find something was to have seen something, and to have seen something was to be a target. The land was cursed in the eyes of the families, and the curse was the legacy of unspeakable violence. In 1956, a road crew widening the old county road found a mass of bones just a few feet from the tree. The county commissioner, a direct descendant of the family that had owned the land after the Civil War, shut down the project immediately. He declared the site a Native American burial mound, a convenient and unquestioned label that effectively silenced any further inquiry. It was a way to keep the secret safe, to avoid the uncomfortable questions that a proper investigation would undoubtedly raise. The bones were simply scooped up and reburied in a nearby ditch, and the road was paved over them. The truth was literally being paved over. And so the secret remained, dormant, but never dead. It was the boy, now a man, who finally broke the silence. In the late 1990s, as he sat with his father on his deathbed, he asked the question that had haunted him for 40 years. "Pa," he said, "what was in that hole?" His father, a man who had carried the weight of that secret for decades, looked at his son and spoke the first real words about that day. "That was no Indian burial ground, boy," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "That was them. The ones the Klan killed. The teacher and her family." It was a final, desperate confession. A passing of a terrible burden. The son, a man named Samuel Shaw, a descendant of one of the families who had attempted to flee, knew then that he was no longer just the keeper of a family secret. He was the keeper of a historical crime. He spent the next 20 years trying to get someone to listen. He contacted state historical societies, the NAACP, and the local sheriff's department. He met with a wall of indifference and outright hostility. The files on the Fairhope incident, if they ever existed, were lost or destroyed in a fire. It was a bureaucratic wall built to protect a community's legacy of shame. The major twist, the one that changes everything we thought we knew, came when Samuel discovered an old ledger in a box of his father's belongings. The ledgers had been preserved for years by the local church. The entries were nothing more than a list of births, deaths, and baptisms in the community. But there was an entry, scratched out but still just legible, that referred to a Delphine McCain. The margin next to her name contained 2 words, written in a different ink and a different hand: murdered. 1868. In the same ledger, a few pages later, the name of the family patriarch, Cyrus Shaw, was listed. Next to his name, the same hand had written, "Not all are lost." This note was a fragment of hope, a cryptic message from the past that suggested that perhaps the narrative we had accepted was incomplete. Perhaps some of those who were supposed to have been killed in the Devil's Den had survived. The discovery led him to a faint trail of records, to a woman in a northern state who had listed her place of birth as Fairhope, Mississippi, and her race as colored. The ledger entry had been right, Delphine McCain had not been killed that night. She had escaped. It took another year of painstaking research for Samuel to find the truth. The story was almost impossible to believe. The night of the trial in the Devil's Den, with the violence raging, the mother of Delphine, who was known to the men as the former housekeeper, had pleaded for her life. She was a woman of a certain age, and she had a skill that they found useful. She knew how to sew and maintain the clothing for the sheriff's family. In a moment of cold pragmatism, the sheriff made a deal. Her life was spared in exchange for her silence and her labor. She was taken from the scene, her hands and mouth bound, and she was installed in a remote cabin on the sheriff's property, a prisoner in all but name. She served as a domestic servant, her presence a dangerous secret, a living testament to the crime that must never be spoken. Delphine, however, had managed to escape the initial slaughter. She had been beaten and left for dead, but the knife wound on her neck was not fatal. She had crawled into the dense undergrowth of the swamp and managed to survive. According to the record Samuel found, after the next heavy rain, a sympathetic family living a few miles away found her near death, clinging to a cypress log. They were terrified, but they were also desperate. They hid her in a root cellar for weeks until she was strong enough to travel. They helped her make her way north. She never knew what happened to her mother, her father, or the others. She believed them all dead. She boarded a steamboat in Memphis, a ticket purchased with her meager savings and the charity of the family who had saved her, and she vanished into the vast, indifferent cities of the North. But in a final, crushing emotional revelation, the story does not end with her escape. In a dusty archive in the county seat, Samuel found a record of a letter written to the Freedmen's Bureau. He was looking for a letter from Delphine, a plea for help, but he instead found a letter from the sheriff, the very man who had orchestrated the crime. In the letter, written in florid and pious language, the sheriff declared that the unfortunate incident at Fairhope was a tragedy of mistaken identity, and that the culprits are a band of renegades who have since fled the region. The letter was a masterpiece of misdirection, a public document designed to close the case and protect the powerful. But it was the final paragraph that Samuel found most chilling. The sheriff wrote that he had personally taken charge of the effects of the dead. Among them, he listed a small, leather-bound journal. The journal, he explained, was deemed to be of a seditious nature and was therefore destroyed. The sheriff, a man who represented the law, had murdered a teacher and burned her diary. He was closing the book, literally, on the story of Delphine McCain and the lost ones of Fairhope. And so we return to the grave. The grave by the hanging tree. It is now a monument, a small, unassuming marker placed there by Samuel Shaw and his family in 2022. It is not a grand gesture, but a simple, defiant acknowledgement that someone was there. It lists the names of Delphine McCain's parents and the other men whose bodies were found in that shallow pit. It is a testament to the enduring power of a family secret, and the long, difficult journey from silence to remembrance. But the mystery that haunts the land, the one that lingers like the fog over the Delta bottomland, is the question of what happened to Delphine McCain. Did she survive? Did she live a long and full life, or did the wounds she suffered, both physical and spiritual, claim her in the end? Her name is not on the monument. There is no grave for her. She is one of the lost. The story of Fairhope is not a unique one. It is the story of countless communities across the post-Reconstruction South. It is the story of a system of violent, systemic terrorism that succeeded in its goal of reversing the progress of freedom. It is a story that was deliberately erased from the public record. It was a conspiracy of silence, enforced by law, by mob violence, and by the simple, brutal power of fear. The bones in the shallow grave were the evidence of this conspiracy. The family secret that was passed down for over a century was the memory of the crime. And it is only now, in our current moment, that we are beginning to listen. We are finally beginning to exhume the truth. But for all that we have uncovered, a final, haunting question remains, a question that echoes across the silent fields of the Delta. Why, after all the details we have uncovered, after piecing together the evidence, after hearing the testimony of the survivors and their descendants, do the official records still refuse to acknowledge what happened in the Devil's Den? Why is the grave still unmarked by any government agency? Why is there no historical marker, no mention in the textbooks, no acknowledgement from the state of Mississippi that an atrocity took place on its soil? Is it simple bureaucratic negligence? Or is it a deeper, more insidious form of denial? The county still refuses to excavate the site. The families who know the truth are still afraid. The secret is no longer a secret, but the silence has not been broken. It has been institutionalized. It has been allowed to persist. And that, perhaps, is the most damning clue of all. The conspiracy was not just a single act of violence. It was a promise of silence that lasted for over a century. The question is not just what happened. The question that still hangs in the air, like the moss from the old oak tree, is why the story of Delphine McCain, the teacher, and the forgotten ones of Fairhope, is still a story that we are not supposed to know. In the absence of a satisfying answer, we are left to wonder if there are still secrets buried in the dark soil of the Delta, secrets that are waiting for another boy, chasing a rabbit, to stumble upon. What will he find?